All right, welcome back to our presentations on the 1960s and 70s. This will be the last presentation on the 60s before moving over to the 1970s. And this one I want to focus on genre in particular, what's going on with genre. Um, and so it's interesting to note that the 1950s was a represented a bunch of crossover of genres that were trying to find their place, and that's part of what made the opportunity for an Elvis Presley so or his timing so great, right? Um, so his timing was really great because he was reaching across multiple genres that were in the process of defining themselves, and he was able to bring those into himself and claim um, a place within each of those. And so his reach was much broader as a result. So as these genres started to land and become their own market segments, all of them knew about Elvis. All of them were informed by his voice, his creative voice, um, and their growth and expansion was his growth and expansion. And so, in that sense, the king thing actually works. But in the sense that it's taken as the king of rock and roll, um, that's, as I mentioned, I've got some issues with that. In any case, so the question here is what's happening to genres in the 60s after the sort of free for all, um, it's almost like after the Big Bang. And I'm not referring to, the Bristol recording sessions, but the explosion of popular music and culture that comes from the prosperity of post World War II, for example, that comes from the combination of sound and film. So all of the technological stuff that's going along, and then with television as well, is sends a bunch of genres into circulation without their having been super well defined. And so that's kind of what the 60s is. It's that period of landing where these genres start to define themselves in terms of the kind of stereotypes that we think of today when you think of, well, what's a rock and roller like versus an old school R&B. What's that vibe like compared to a country singer or gospel? All of these genres have a horizon of expectation in terms of what the feel, sound, even the group of people that are going to be associated, and the clothing that they wear. So it's all part of um, the hmm, the way that popular culture acts as a composite way of creating identity. That took me a while to get to that, but that's exactly what I wanted to say. So it's composed kind of like you put on clothing. So popular music is like clothing in that way. Okay, so let's look at country music in the 1960s. So in the 1960s, we get more insulated market segments as opposed to the confusion of the 1950s. Um, so the 1960s sees uh, a crossover, or I'm sorry, in the 1950s you see R&B and country both crossing over to pop, like we said with Elvis. And so, culturally speaking, how do we, interpret this separation of pulling country away from pop or R&B away from pop? So you can read it along the racial lines that I've suggested this far in the class, as this is a reaction to racial mixing, right? Racial integration that was perhaps a little bit early. And you can see this being pushed in the 1960s with, Woodstock. Well, you can see the pictures are not you do have mixing there of a lot of different cultures, but it's still primarily a white folks party, if you will. But they didn't think of themselves in that way, and that was the point. The people who attended that were seeing themselves much more as fellow, like a brotherhood of man type of situation. And so that created some problems, obviously. So there's this constant ongoing tension between, what is the American value of the mainstream, which is dictated by, hegemony um, from institutions that are largely controlled by older white folks concerned about what younger white folks are exposed to. And so you can read this kind of cleaning up this confusion of genres. You can read that as a reaction to the integration. You can also look at it in terms of, the the walls being that were used to separate different groups were kind of being rebuilt. And so Elvis was one of those early sort of crossover figures. He was out of circulation as a musician during his time in the Army. Chuck Berry was also famously jailed for crossing state lines with an underage girl who also happened to be white. Otherwise, I'm not sure that it would have been quite as newsworthy of a story. And so he had been jailed for the kind of the high point of his career. And so these walls that you see of separating people back into their boxes are the exact walls that the hippie sort of counterculture seeks to destroy. And I think that that's really an interesting concept when you look at, well, aren't these people just out to smoke a bunch of marijuana and grow their hair real long and listen to music too loud and kind of be tripped out and not clean? Not, that's all of the superficial parts of it, but they're seeking to undo these categories and get to deeper underlying meaning, right? So Patsy Cline emerges as one of the shining stars of country music in the 1960s. Now, unfortunately, you can see she didn't make it very far into the 1960s, and I don't know as well as I should the story of her passing and her life and stuff. So this is another area where, if somebody wants to focus in on Patsy Cline, for example, and do an extended look at her life story and what's kind of behind these songs and things like that, I completely invite that. I'm showing you guys little snippets, and so I'm trying to feed your idea, because it's about time to be thinking about not just your presentation if you haven't done one yet, but the ultimate your final, what you want to focus on in terms of not just a decade or two, but something even more detailed. And so I'm trying to feed you some ideas. So the Nashville sound, right? So there's kind of that high twinkling piano on Walking After Men, on Crazy for sure. A softer crooning style of singing. Is this I Can't Help Falling in Love? Oh no, this is Crazy. Okay, so there's you can hear that high twinkling piano back there. There is a Nashville sound that is starting to emerge around the success of Patsy Cline in particular. Now, on the R&B and soul side, I would say Ray Charles is probably the most towering figure. He was, interestingly, I would say it's hard to say when he peaked or if he did, because he was so strong for so long. In the 1940s, he really hadn't discovered himself yet. He was expert in imitating the stylings of Charles Brown and Nat King Cole, and singing that kind of crooning style, very soft whisper vocals over mellow jazz, but that was, more of a trendy thing. By the time you get to the 1960s, here you've got a black piano player who's blind and has been doing, gospel and blues, deciding, hey, I'm going to do a country album. What do you think about that? How do you like them apples? So very self-aware and very concerted in terms of doing what he needed to. Can I call you right back? Thanks. Um, and so, it didn't make the pop charts, but it was a big statement. This song, Swanee River Rock, is much more what I think of. So this is the 1950s Ray Charles. So you got to check that out. This is, his innovation during the 50s, I would say, would be to do an operation like a doctor would on gospel music. So he took gospel music and he surgically removed the references to spiritual love of God and replaced it with physical love of a woman. And so a lot of his sounds it's sort of jump blues, yes, but it's jump blues meets gospel, and then he has his own voice really coming through, which is fantastic. Now, to see the power of this guy as a musical genius, I wanted to put this video in here, which is, let's see, about 3 minutes long. So please do check this out. But this is him singing a slow blues at the Newport Jazz Festival in, I think, 61. That is riveting. And so I can't say enough about Ray. But we got to move on to, in this case, Sam Cooke. Now, Sam Cooke, you can see there's tension going on between gospel and popular music in the example that I gave you a second ago with Ray Charles. Sam Cooke did kind of the opposite. So he crossed over from gospel to mainstream music in 1956. He did not try to necessarily operate on gospel music. He made a clean break. But then, which is a huge gamble, by the way, because once you sort of reject the church as your home base and you're like, okay, I'm going to do something different. If you fail, guess what? You got no home base no more. And so he didn't fail. And what he did, I thought, was remarkable. So after he made it as a popular popular music artist, he reached back to the top group of, that he had been with, the Soul Stirrers. He reached back to them and said, I want to produce you and try to get the gospel message, optimized, even further distribution, everything bigger and more. And so, I thought that was a cool gesture, even though most of the gospel community had rejected him as profane at that point in time. And when he did cross over, his catalog had become really politicized. And so he also passed young, right? So he's 33. Another interesting story I invite someone to tell is this guy. So after he passed, his catalog became progressively politicized. And so when he sings a change is going to come, that was read by, protesters, cultural commentators of the day as a black response to Bob Dylan's Blowin' in the Wind. And the fact that he was friends with Malcolm X, also Bob Dylan, Muhammad Ali, also played into that. So here's an example of his gospel sound with I'm a Pilgrim. I really love that stuff. And then here he is on TV with Dick Clark, playing a wonderful song that I really love, and then doing an interview where he talks about being a songwriter. And so I recommend you check that out. Sam Cooke, also super fascinating guy. Aretha Franklin and James Brown, the godfather and the queen of soul music, they also were bringing this form into the mainstream and very responsible with, being signed by RCA. I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You in 1967. Aretha Franklin deep gospel roots. And you kind of hear it coming through on her piano. Singer-songwriter, symbolized female empowerment. James Brown, on the other hand, is like, declaring black confidence. Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud, in 1968. One of the most sampled musicians by rap artists. And you can even look at I'm Black and I'm Proud as a precursor to rap music, or proto-rap. After the MLK assassination, just as we saw Sam Cooke's music being sort of reappraised in terms of its potential political content, now we have overt efforts to position popular music needs to be positioned in a political context. And so soul music is being read as cultural affirmation. And Brown, James Brown starts to assume a political edge, becomes more outspoken. Who wouldn't, right? I mean, after the treacherous act. Outside of all of that, and this is, I would say, reacting in a sense to his position, and recognizing his moment in time. But when you look, so here is a video of him, his dance moves. So check out James Brown. I think this is early to mid 60s, looking at the white Fender amplifiers, probably 65. In any case, close to being at the peak of his powers here. You can see the dress. He ran a super tight ship. If you were one of his musicians and you didn't have your shoes shined up to a high sparkle, he would find you on the spot. And so just a force of music and creative talent. Once again, the full package here, from composing his own stuff, singing, looking sharp, running, being a super powerful band leader, having that outspoken voice. So this is someone who's able to capitalize on their position in society and make the kind of change that they want seen. Talked a little bit about Bob Dylan. So, urban folk revivalist, right? So he's taking these different countercultural motifs that would kind of explode in the late 60s hippie movement. But you've got people like the Weavers, Pete Seeger, who are being associated with the communist movement, calling for workers' rights, that kind of thing. You don't want to push that too hard, apparently, in the 50s. And so you got to remember, in the 50s is the time of the Cold War, and so you've got fears of communist messages in popular music are leading to popular musicians being blacklisted. Pete Seeger as one of those. And so Dylan kind of was a standout within that scene. So he's young when he came into it. The community perceived itself to be under duress or under attack. And so he was able to communicate a lot in as a very, probably one of popular music's greatest lyricists. Recognized by winning a Nobel Prize for literature. He ignored it. He didn't show up to collect it. It wasn't important to him. I think he ultimately agreed to accept it, but it tells you something about where his values are, right? To have an award of that scope and to basically say, this is not what I'm about. He was kind of unpolished, aggressive, harmonica voice was a little bit, raspy and on the edge. And finally, in the outrage of all outrages, in 1965, he went electric and kind of came to this folk festival with the band and Mike Bloomfield on guitar, electric blues guitar player, and had an electric guitar himself. So here you see him in the year before, 1964, singing in a very sort of what you would expect for the Newport Folk Festival, playing Tambourine Man with his harmonica and guitar, acoustic music.
On a trip
There's lots to read into. It's almost like reading a poem when you listen to all of those lyrics. I think I've got him a little bit thin there. There we go. And then he comes back the next year and gets booed off of the stage because he's got a leather jacket, and he does have his harmonica still, same kind of microphone, but he's playing a Fender Stratocaster electric guitar through a guitar amplifier, and so the community felt completely betrayed. Right, the folk community was like, couldn't believe it. Their superstar, performer, the voice of the young generation, right, the hope of folk music, had kind of gone to the dark side. So that's also an interesting story if anybody wants to look in on that and what happened to him afterwards. Okay, so rock music, you've got folk rock there. So just as the 60s you're seeing these other genres coming into focus with soul music, country music. Rock had already been in place for a decade, and so it starts to splinter. And that is a harbinger or an indicator of what's to come for, music genres as they sort of reach their elaboration or reach their pinnacle. Then where do they go? Well, usually they split up and go into multiple other genres. So psychedelic rock is one of those early splinters of rock and roll, oftentimes associated with the Haight-Ashbury intersection, right? Interesting. I invite anybody to look up Kim Casey's Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. I'm sure many of you have read that. I know we all did in high school. But it talks about this scene. Where does psychedelic rock come from? What kind of, scene was it? What were people into? There's a lot of, expectations. There was a lot of mystique, so the Beatles actually went out there to check it out, and they were completely put off by what they saw. George Harrison was like, looked like a bunch of homeless kids who needed a bath. It was actually, a lot of people ran away from home when the Beatles wrote She's Leaving Home on Sgt. Pepper's. It has a lot to do with the move westward, counterculture, messaging, turning kids against their families, running a lot of runaways, and they would just go out to the West Coast and think that everything was going to be all right. So you've got Jefferson Airplane, the first acid rockers out of San Francisco. Grace Slick was the queen of the scene. Got a $20,000 advance on our RCA deal in 1965. So that's early for acid rock. Janis Joplin, ran away from home, moved out to San Francisco, and so she was a challenger as the queen of the scene to Grace Slick. Her performance at the Monterey Pop Fest led to the Columbia record deal, and she really did a lot in terms of combining, blues and rock. So if those are two genres that you like, I'm sure you're into Janis Joplin. And of course, you can't mention psychedelic rock without the Grateful Dead. I do remember getting a chance to see them and appreciating their sort of, it was almost like a black market, type of a vibe. They encouraged people to record their shows and actually set up. So 99.9% of concerts you go to have, no recording this, no recording that signs everywhere. And they're like, yeah, please do record us. And then it cultivates this sort of trading post, people exchanging tapes. And underground, trade, it expands their fan base in a new and different way. They had an entire, so that tour culture, precursor to Fish, was a band that momentarily recaptured that in the 1990s. I talked about the bootlegs, recordings. It's just, if you're either a deadhead or you're not, I don't know exactly what to say about these folks. Interesting, the Bear icon. So anybody wants to look into the backstory of Bear Owlsley, Stanley, he was their sound man, but also an LSD cook, and would whip up, hundreds of thousands of hits of LSD in like the hotel bathroom or whatever, and in the liquid form, and then go to shows and put it in a squirt gun and just douse the crowd. You think about a scene being wide open. It's probably rivals Kansas City in the late 30s for what was going on. Now, one of my favorite things about the Dead, of course, is their sound system. So dig this PA system. It's kind of like modular and sectional. So I think the vocals were through that thing above the drummer, that sort of curved contraption. And then you have, the guitar rig is a certain section of those speakers. The bass guitar rig is another section of those speakers. And so when you look at, the spread of popular music in terms of its power to make a pop icon or to spread messages, the technological part is big. You would not see something like this in the 1950s. This is very early, and it didn't need to be this bizarre, but it's the Grateful Dead. But you think of the ability to reach people at a distance, and so that's a bunch of speakers, right? So what are these guys actually saying? What's their messaging? And so it's really whatever they wanted it to be. I mean, the Grateful Dead was largely started as a blues band, continued largely as a cover band, but they covered such obscure and traditional songs in their own way that no one really ever thought of them that way. And of course, they did write plenty of their own songs, and that's kind of one of the main things you need to have a hit. But so anyway, that's a little look at how genre developed into the mainstream in the 1960s. All right, we will be talking soon.